The night hums with laughter, glass clinks, and the low thrum of music that hides every nervous heartbeat. Evan stands at the edge of his own birthday party, watching people celebrate him as if he's still part of their world. It's strange how noise can make silence louder. Then the crowd parts like a tide and Lila steps through, a memory wrapped in a red dress. The same eyes that once promised forever now carry the weight of regret. For a moment, everything freezes. The music fades to a pulse. She leans close, her breath trembling against the chaos, and whispers, "I still love you." The words slice through the years like glass. Evan smiles faintly, not with joy, but with the quiet relief of understanding. Some stories don't end with flames. They burn until nothing's left to save. And as the candles flicker out, he realizes the gift he wanted most tonight was the courage to walk away. The sound of the door clicking shut behind him is almost merciful. Outside, the night air feels colder than he remembers. A quiet reminder that endings don't come with thunder, only silence. He can still hear her voice echoing faintly beneath the music that seeps through the walls. For a heartbeat, he hesitates. Then he breathes, deep and steady, as though learning how to again. Freedom doesn't feel triumphant. It feels hollow, uncertain. But even hollow spaces can hold peace. He walks into the parking lot, under strings of dying light, and realizes the world doesn't collapse when you choose yourself. It just finally stops spinning around someone else's gravity. Mara catches up to him near the street, her heels clicking sharp against the pavement. She doesn't ask. She never does. Just studies him with that patient silence she's always carried. He doesn't need words. Neither does she. Their friendship has always thrived in what's left unsaid. Finally, she mutters, "You okay?" He nods, lying through the smile that doesn't reach his eyes. In the reflection of a passing car's window, he sees the ghost of who he used to be. A man chasing validation from someone who never learned how to stay. Tonight, that version of him dies quietly. And it feels strangely merciful. Inside the venue, laughter resumes, brittle and forced, like a song on repeat. Lila stands alone beside the fading cake, her lipstick smudged, her confession still hanging in the air. The lights are too bright now, exposing everything she wanted hidden. Her new boyfriend jokes with someone at the bar, unaware of the words she's just unleashed. For a moment, she considers chasing Evan, but her feet stay still. Maybe love isn't about who you run after, but who you finally stop running from. Evan sits in his car, engine off, watching the fog build on the windshield. Each breath paints a small circle of warmth before fading again. He thinks of her whisper, not as a wound, but as a truth finally freed. There's beauty in endings when they stop pretending to be beginnings. He starts the car, headlights slicing through the night, and drives away, not towards something new, but away from everything that kept him standing still. The past doesn't knock. It simply walks in, uninvited. As Evan drives through the sleeping city, old memories rise like fog from the asphalt. The first time he saw her in a downtown cafe, sunlight spilling through dusty windows. She had paint on her hands, coffee stains on her sketchbook, and a laugh that sounded like the start of something dangerous. He didn't believe in fate, but that day made him question the logic of timing. She'd looked up from her drawings, met his gaze, and said something about how strangers sometimes feel familiar. It was the kind of beginning that feels scripted until it isn't, the kind that convinces you the universe is listening. He didn't know yet that every spark carries the blueprint of its own ash. Their world began to merge in small, ordinary ways. 2 toothbrushes by the sink, her art supplies invading his drafting table. Evenings smelled of coffee, paint thinner, and late-night dreams spoken into the dark. They planned futures with laughter and reckless certainty, sketching the outlines of a life neither of them could keep. He loved how she saw beauty in chaos. She loved how he found peace in order. For a while, that balance worked. Her storms gave his calm a pulse, and his steadiness gave her storms a shore. But love is never static. It shifts under the weight of what's unsaid. Somewhere between the laughter and the silences, cracks began to form, invisible but growing, waiting for their moment to split open. It started with something small, a missed dinner, a forgotten promise. Then came the fights, not with shouting, but with silence that filled entire rooms. Lila's art grew darker, his patience thinner. Love didn't disappear overnight. It eroded like stone under constant rain. They both tried to fix it. Weekend trips, forced laughter, apologies rehearsed until they lost meaning. There's a kind of heartbreak that doesn't explode. It fades, and that's the cruelest kind, because you never see the exact moment it's gone. Evan remembers standing at their balcony one night, looking out at the city lights while she painted behind him. The distance between them had never felt so physical. The night it ended was quiet. No shouting, no slammed doors. Just two people realizing they'd reached the end of a language neither could speak anymore. She'd been crying before he came home, mascara marking trails of surrender. He didn't ask why. He already knew. She said she felt trapped between who she was and who he wanted her to be. He said nothing because he knew she was right. There's a grief in loving someone you no longer recognize. She packed a suitcase, slowly, as if hoping time would forgive her for it. When the door closed behind her, he didn't chase. Some losses are too familiar to fight. Months passed, and silence became a new rhythm. Evan buried himself in work, in motion, in anything that didn't sound like her voice. Lila painted through sleepless nights, her canvases haunted by what-ifs. Neither reached out, though both imagined the other doing so. Time is cruel like that. It gives distance the illusion of healing, while the heart still remembers every color of love. When Evan finally saw her again, it wasn't in person but through a gallery window. One of her paintings hung there. A man standing in front of a burning house, his back turned to the flames. It was called The Last Candle. He understood then that love, once gone, becomes art, something beautiful and untouchable. 3 days after the party, the message arrived. "Can we talk?" Evans stared at it for an hour before replying with silence. The mind argues, the heart listens. He didn't owe her anything. Not a response, not a memory, not another chance to reopen what had finally sealed. But closure is seductive, disguised as reason. That evening, he found himself parked outside the small cafe where it had all begun. The same chipped paint on the door, the same hum of traffic, as if time had refused to move on without them. When she walked in, he felt that familiar ache, not of longing but of recognition. They sat across from each other like actors revisiting a scene that once mattered. She smiled, cautious. "You look different," she said softly. He smiled back. I stopped waiting. Their conversation started safely, like two people testing thin ice. Small talk about work, mutual friends, the weather. Anything that didn't feel like confession. But silence found them again, heavy and waiting. Finally, Lila broke it. "I shouldn't have come to the party," she said, voice trembling. "I didn't plan it. I just needed you to know I still care." Evan studied her, trying to find the woman he once knew inside the one now sitting across from him. She looked softer, older, more fragile, like someone learning how to forgive herself. "Lila," he said quietly, "you're not the villain in my story. You're just the ending." Her lip quivered, and for the first time she didn't argue. Some truths are too gentle to fight. Rain began to fall outside. Soft at first, then relentless. Lila reached for her purse, pulling out a small envelope. "I never showed you this," she said, sliding it across the table. Inside was a photo. The painting from her last exhibit, the one called The Last Candle. But this version was unfinished. The man wasn't turned away from the flames. He was walking into them. "This was what it was supposed to be," she whispered. "Before I realized you'd already left." Evan stared at it, the image blurring as memories overlapped with the rain-streaked glass. For a long moment, neither spoke. The past had a way of haunting gently, not with screams but with sighs that never ended. When they finally stepped outside, the rain had become a curtain between worlds. Lila walked beside him, coat pulled tight, mascara streaking faintly down her cheeks. "Do you ever think we could have made it work?" she asked, almost whispering. Evan looked up at the gray sky, searching for an answer that wouldn't hurt. "We did," he said after a pause. "For a while we did." She nodded, understanding the truth in its simplicity. Love wasn't meant to be eternal. It was meant to be real, and theirs had been. Standing there under the streetlight, drenched and trembling, they looked less like lovers and more like two survivors of the same beautiful wreck. They stood at the corner where their paths would split again, hers toward the old part of town, his toward silence. "Take care of yourself," she said. He nodded, voice steady. "You too." There was no goodbye kiss, no lingering touch. Just the quiet understanding that some people love you forever by leaving when it's right. As she walked away, the city seemed to swallow her shape into its neon haze. Evan waited until she disappeared completely before crossing the street. The rain slowed, the air cooled, and for the first time in years, his heart felt light enough to breathe without her name attached. The rain didn't stop for hours. Evan walked aimlessly through the city, the storm washing away every trace of her voice. Neon lights bled across wet asphalt, turning the streets into rivers of memory. He thought of everything they'd shared. The laughter that once filled small apartments, the nights spent dreaming of futures that never arrived. Somewhere between those memories and the present, he realized forgiveness wasn't something she had to earn. It was something he had to give, not to her, but to himself. He paused at a crosswalk, watching strangers hurry past under umbrellas. Everyone was chasing shelter, but he stayed in the rain, because for the first time it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like release. The next morning, sunlight spilled weakly through his apartment blinds. Everything looked different, quieter, gentler. He made coffee without thinking of her, without the ghost of shared mornings lingering in the corners. When he sat at his desk, the half-finished sketches from months ago waited like loyal companions. He picked up a pencil and began to draw again. Not buildings this time. Something simpler. A candle on a windowsill, flames steady despite the wind outside. For the first time, his hands didn't shake. Letting go, he realized, wasn't about forgetting. It was about creating something that no longer needed to survive in the dark. That afternoon, Mara stopped by unannounced, her presence as grounding as always. She glanced at his table, at the candle sketch, and smiled knowingly. "You're drawing again," she said. "Guess that means you're breathing again, too." He laughed softly. There was no pretense with Mara, no history to untangle. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him, silent for a while. Finally, she asked, "If she called again, would you answer?" He didn't hesitate. "No," he said simply, "because this time I'd rather listen to the quiet." The answer surprised even him, not because it hurt, but because it didn't. Across town, Lila stood in her studio surrounded by unfinished canvases. Each brushstroke felt heavier, each color a confession. She painted the same figure again and again, a man walking away, always toward light. Her art had become therapy, her apology written in pigment. She stopped painting for a moment, stepping back to look. The room smelled of turpentine and rain-soaked linen. Somewhere deep down, she knew he wouldn't come back. And strangely, that knowledge didn't break her anymore. Sometimes closure doesn't come from someone else's words, but from finally hearing your own. That evening, Evan returned to the cafe, not to relive, but to reclaim. The same seat, the same table, but this time, no ghosts waited. He watched strangers pass by the window, each lost in their own silent film of longing and survival. The air smelled of roasted coffee and new beginnings. He smiled faintly, realizing that sometimes life doesn't offer clean endings, only moments where peace quietly replaces the noise. The waitress asked if he was waiting for someone. He shook his head. "No," he said softly. "Just remembering how far I've come." And for the first time, it wasn't a memory that hurt. It was one that healed. Autumn came early that year, the air heavy with the scent of rain and falling leaves. Evan found himself walking through the park, where he and Lila once spent afternoons pretending forever was real. The benches were slick with dew, the trees stripped bare like memories losing color. He sat down beneath the same willow where she once read to him from her sketchbook, her voice trembling with hope. For a moment he closed his eyes and imagined that version of them, two dreamers who hadn't yet learned that love sometimes has an expiration date. When he opened them again, the world looked sharper, cleaner. The ache was still there, but softer now, like the aftertaste of a bittersweet song he no longer needed to hum. At her studio, Lila painted through the fading daylight, the rhythmic scrape of her brush the only sound in the room. On the canvas, Evan's outline again, this time dissolving into soft light. Her fingers trembled as she mixed the final color, a pale gold that glowed like memory. "This one's the last," she whispered to herself. Though part of her didn't believe it, she thought of him often, but less painfully now, as if her mind was teaching her heart to breathe without him. She signed the corner with a quiet exhale, then stepped back. For the first time, her painting didn't look like loss. It looked like release. Days later, Evan received a letter, postmarked but unsigned. Inside was a photograph of a painting, the one from her new exhibit. On the back, a single sentence. "Thank you for teaching me how to end beautifully." He read it twice, then placed it on his desk beside the candle, drawing Hyde made weeks before. It didn't hurt. It simply existed, like a chapter written in another lifetime. He lit an actual candle, watched the flame dance, and smiled faintly. Maybe endings weren't meant to be mourned. Maybe they were just reminders that everything real leaves light behind, even when it burns out. Lila attended her own gallery opening that weekend, surrounded by strangers admiring pieces born from her grief. She moved among them gracefully, smiling when people asked about her inspiration. "It was about love," she said simply, "and learning when to let it go." Beneath the gallery's bright lights, she felt weightless, not because she'd forgotten him, but because she'd finally learned how to carry him without breaking. When she turned to leave, she caught sight of her reflection in the glass. For the first time in years, she didn't look lost. She looked free. That night, Evan drove beyond the city, windows down, wind sharp against his face. The road stretched endlessly beneath a moonlit sky. He pulled over near a lake where the stars scattered across the water like shards of forgotten wishes. Standing there, he realized life wasn't something you fix. It's something you live, moment by moment, choice by choice. He reached into his pocket, pulled out the matchbook from the cafe, and struck a single flame. The light danced for a heartbeat before he let it fall into the water, disappearing with a hiss. "Goodbye," he whispered, not to her, not to love, but to who he used to be. Mornings became simple again. Evan woke to the sound of sparrows tapping at the window, sunlight spilling across the sheets like forgiveness. The world outside was still the same hum of traffic, the same city pulse, but something in him had changed. The noise no longer overwhelmed. It simply existed. He made breakfast, poured 2 cups of coffee out of habit, then smiled faintly before pouring one back into the pot. Grief, he'd learned, doesn't vanish. It settles into the quiet corners, softening until it feels like a memory of warmth instead of ache. He stepped onto his balcony, the city spread before him like an unfinished sketch, and breathed in the promise of a day that belonged only to him. Lila began teaching art classes at a small community studio near the river. The children didn't care about Heartbreak or galleries. They cared about colors that made them happy. "Make it bright," she'd tell them, laughing when their hands became canvases themselves. It felt strange, being needed in a way that didn't drain her. One afternoon, a girl asked why all her paintings showed sunlight. Lila paused, thinking. "Because I've spent enough time painting the dark," she said. The words surprised her, honest and unforced. That night, she walked home with paint still on her hands, smiling at how strange it felt to finally live a life untouched by ghosts. Evan spent his evenings sketching again, not for clients, but for himself. Buildings became metaphors, foundations mirroring his own rebuilding. Sometimes Mara would stop by with takeout, and they'd talk about anything but the past. "You're lighter now," she said once, smiling. "Guess you finally let go." He looked up from his sketch pad, the graphite smudged across his fingertips. "Maybe letting go isn't the hard part," he said. "Maybe it's realizing you were never really holding on." They laughed. The kind that fills a room without needing to prove anything. The kind that sounds like peace. Lila visited her parents' house for the first time in years. The garden was overgrown, the swing creaking in the breeze, unchanged since childhood. She walked through the rooms slowly, fingertips brushing the walls, collecting echoes of simpler times. In her old bedroom, she found one of her earliest paintings, a small candle burning bright against a dark background. She laughed softly, realizing she'd been painting her truth all along. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she whispered, "I'm okay now." And for the first time, she believed it. On a quiet Sunday, Evan drove to the lake again. The water was still, mirroring the sky in flawless reflection. He stood at the same spot where he'd once said goodbye, only now, there was no need for words. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small matchbook. The last one. He didn't light it this time. He simply held it for a moment before tossing it gently into the water, watching it float away. The act wasn't dramatic, but it was final. Sometimes peace doesn't arrive with music or epiphany. Sometimes it just arrives, silently, completely, like the calm surface of a lake that no longer remembers the storm. A year later, on another October evening, Evan's apartment glowed with candlelight and laughter. Friends gathered for his birthday again. The same ritual that had once marked the beginning of his goodbye. But this time the air felt lighter. There were no ghosts, no unspoken names hiding behind smiles. When Mara handed him the cake, 33 candles flickered like a constellation of new beginnings. "Make a wish," she teased. Evan smiled, looking at the gentle chaos of people who had stayed, who never asked him to be anyone else. He closed his eyes and didn't wish for love or closure or even forgiveness. He wished for nothing, because, for the first time, he already had enough. Across town, Lila watched the city lights flicker through her window. Her gallery was quiet now, the walls bare, each painting sold, each story set free. She sipped tea from a chipped mug, the one Evan had once teased her for never replacing. It had survived everything, the moves, the heartbreak, the storms. And now, it sat in her hands like an artifact of growth. She smiled softly, tracing a faint crack along its side. Some things don't need fixing to be beautiful. She turned off the lights, leaving one candle burning near the window, its glow steady against the night. "Happy birthday," she whispered into the quiet, and the city, almost knowingly, glimmered in reply. Later that week, Evan walked past a small art shop on his way to work. In the display window hung a familiar painting, The Last Candle, its flame rendered in soft gold and ivory, glowing like a heartbeat. He stopped, not out of shock, but recognition. It no longer hurt to see her art. It felt like seeing an old photograph of a life well lived. A woman passing by smiled at him. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said. Evan nodded. "Yeah," he murmured. "It really is." Then he kept walking, the image lingering behind him like sunlight caught on water. Something that doesn't fade, only follows quietly. That evening, Lila received a small envelope in the mail. Inside was a postcard, a sketch of a single candle drawn in pencil. No words, no name, just the art. She smiled instantly, recognizing his hand in the strokes. It wasn't a message, not even a memory, just acknowledgement. Proof that two people could love, lose, and still honor the story that made them. She pinned it to her studio wall beside her newest painting, a sunrise, and as she stood there, she felt something shift. Not closure, but continuity. Life wasn't about burning out. It was about learning how to glow differently. A year of silence, a lifetime of echoes, and yet peace. Evan stood on his balcony that night, a single candle flickering beside him. The city hummed below, steady and alive. He watched the flame, steady but swaying, and felt an old warmth rise in his chest. Maybe love was never meant to stay. Maybe it was meant to teach. The flame flickered once, twice, then steadied again. Fragile, but unwavering. He closed his eyes, breathed deep, and smiled. Some goodbyes end in darkness. Others end in light. His ended in both. The quiet glow of one last candle that no longer burned for her, but for everything he'd become since she let go.